Hi, this is Dave. One of the most powerful verses in the Bible, and one that really resonates with me, is Romans 12:2, where the apostle says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's because I like to think and I think about thinking. That's always been a verse that has resonated with me. But, my question today is, how do we implement that? How can we take that verse and make it something that impacts our lives and our businesses? So that's it. That's what we're going to be looking at today. This is this is one of the 25 most important lessons I have learned. I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast that some time ago, one of my clients suggested to me that I think of and create a list of the 20 most important lessons I've learned over my 30 years of working with over 500 different sales organizations. And, at first I kind of blew it off, but then the more I thought about it, I thought, that's really not a bad idea. And so I put together a list and honed it down, and it came to 25. So this is one of the 25 most important lessons I've learned, and that is that you can choose your thoughts and shape your destiny. You can implement the Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You can, in fact, renew your mind. Let's get into it. My wife is a crisis counselor. One of her biggest eye-openers occurred when she realized she was counseling the same people over and over again. Now, you would think that a crisis was an isolated event, and probably true for most of the population. But some folks just lurch from one crisis to another. Why is that? They have not learned to change their behavior because they have not learned to control their thoughts. They have acquired patterns of thinking, which we often label as attitudes. They've acquired them in an earlier age, and they never learned how to think differently. On the other hand, we've all seen interviews with highly successful people and heard them expound on the principles of positive thinking. They attribute their success to learning how to control their thoughts and manifest their goals. Learning to control your thoughts, to choose to think some things and not others, that marks a watershed event in a person's life. I recall the time that I made that discovery. I had been the number one salesperson in the nation for a company, my first full-time professional sales job. I was comfortable. I had an adequate salary, I had good benefits, I had a company car, I had the potential to earn a good bonus, and I had the respect of my employer and my colleagues. But the opportunities were limited, and I decided to move to a job that was completely different. I took a sales job with a new company selling surgical staplers to hospitals. It was a huge leap from the secure job that I had to one that paid straight commission and for which I had to buy my own samples. I had to buy my literature for the company. But I was cocky and young and dumb, and I was filled with the success of my previous job, and I was sure that I could make this work also. Now, I wasn't hasty. I looked at the amount of existing business in the territory that I was slated for and determined that if I could double the business, and that was a doable task, I was assured, if I could double the business, I'd be back making about what I was used to, and then as I increased the business from there, my income and lifestyle would certainly evidence the difference. Well, it all sounded good, and I left my old job and arrived in New York City for 6 weeks of intensive training on the new one. During the time that I was there, my district manager, the fellow who had hired me, was replaced. He moved on to something else, and there was a new manager. And when I arrived home after the training, the new manager was eager to meet with me. In our first meeting, before I had a chance to begin working, he informed me that he had revised the sales territories. The territory that I thought I had, the one I was hired for, well, that was not the one I was going to get. Instead, I was going to receive just a territory that had just a fraction of that business. And the new territory contained actually about a third of the existing business of the previous one. And that change meant my plans for making a living looked like they were shot. It looked like it was an impossible task. So I was upset and angry. Like, how could they do this to me? At this time, I had 5 kids to support. I felt the pressure to provide, and I immediately began to look for another job, determined to quickly leave this unethical and uncaring company. Things got worse. As I interviewed with several companies, I discovered that they saw me as the problem. Instead of understanding what the company had done to me, they thought I was an opportunist who was looking for an easy way out. Basically, no one else was going to hire me. I grew more and more angry and more bitter. In addition, I had little success selling the Staplers. After 6 months, my temporary draw came to an end. I owed the company $10,000. I was earning almost nothing, and I had no prospects for another job. I felt squeezed between the proverbial rock and the hard place, man. That's where I was. And then, somewhere in there, I had an epiphany. Yes, the company was unethical. Yes, they had done a bad thing to me. But the reason I was not achieving had nothing to do with that. It was my fault. It was me. In my anger and my bitterness and my resentment, my victim attitude, it was that was keeping me back. The product was still exciting. The opportunity was still great. The real problem was my attitude. My bitterness and anger were getting in the way of everything. So I accepted my responsibility to change my performance, and I saw that I had to change my attitude. And in order to change my attitude, I had to change my thinking. So I set about to do so. And here's what I did. I looked up Bible verses that were very inspiring. Verses like, "If God is for you, who can be against you?" I wrote them down on 3x5 cards. I have a stack. As a matter of fact, I still have that stack of 3x5 cards today. I'm not going to tell you how long it's been, but decades. I've had them for decades. Then, so back to my stack of 3x5 cards. As I drove into my territory every day along I-96 in Detroit, I held that stack of cards in my hand on the steering wheel and read them over and over to myself. I would read one, flip it over, read the next one, flip it over, and so on, all the while keeping myself safe on the freeway. And slowly I began to do away with my bitter attitude and replace it with hope and expectation. And my results began to change also. Really, truly, things were transformed by the renewing of my mind. Things began to go better. 6 months later, I had paid off the debt to the company, $10,000, and that was a lot of money back then. And I was making more money than I thought possible. The job had become fun, more financially rewarding, and more fulfilling than anything I had ever expected. And the change happened when I decided to change my thoughts. Now, there's certainly nothing new about that observation. Solomon, writing centuries before Christ, said, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he." Of course, it was Paul who said, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." See, the relationship between thoughts and actions and results has been recognized probably since the dawn of mankind. But the problem is, of course, actually doing it. It's one thing to realize it intellectually, it's another to actually do it. One of the best business books of the 20th century was one called Learned Optimism by Dr. Martin Seligman. And in that book, Learned Optimism, he describes his life work. As a research psychologist, Dr. Seligman began by studying helplessness in dogs. In an early experiment, he put dogs in a cage from which they could not escape and subjected them to mild shocks. After some effort at escape, the dogs would give up trying and just lay down. They would give up. And later, he put them in a cage from which they could easily escape and subjected them to the same mild shocks. The dogs would just lie down and give up. Surprisingly, they did not attempt to remove themselves from the irritant they had learned, helplessness and hopelessness. In subsequent experiments, Dr. Seligman found a similar behavior in human beings. Put into a room and subjected to irritating noises from which they could not escape, they soon learned to give up. Then, when put into a room with a mechanism that would turn off the noise, they did not even try. They had, like the dogs, learned helplessness and hopelessness. From this beginning, Dr. Seligman continued to formulate a thesis he calls learned optimism. And it says, basically, that human beings learn to have either a pessimistic or an optimistic outlook. And Dr. Seligman's book contains a self-assessment to measure the degree of pessimism or optimism of the reader. Dr. Seligman's thesis arises from the way people explain negative events to themselves. When something negative happens, as it eventually will, the way you explain it to yourself determines your pessimistic and optimistic attitude. There are three components of this explanatory style. The first component is the degree to which you believe the event will be permanent. Pessimists believe negative events will be permanent, while optimists believe that they will be temporary. The second component is pervasiveness. So first it's permanence, then pervasiveness. Pessimists believe the causes of negative events are universal, affecting everything that they do. Optimists believe them to be specific and limited to individual circumstances. And there's one more component, personal. So we have permanent, pervasive, and personal. Pessimists believe that negative events are caused by themselves. Optimists believe that the world is at fault. So here's how this behavioral perspective works every day, and I'm going to use the life of a salesperson here as an example because I work a lot with salespeople. So let's say you visit one of your large accounts and your main contact announces that the vice president of operations has signed a sole source vendor agreement with your largest competitor and that all of your business will be moved to that competitor within the next 30 days. Now that is a negative event. And as you drive away from the account, you think to yourself, quote, I blew it here. I should have seen it coming. I'm never going to learn this job. I'll blow the next one too. I mismanaged them all. Now, that is a pessimistic explanation of the event. Notice that you have explained it in a way that is personal. You said, quote, I blew it. Your explanation is also permanent. I'm never going to learn to do this job. And your explanation is pervasive. I mismanaged them all. So your explanation of what happened is personal, permanent, and pervasive. Now, just stop a minute and analyze how you feel as a result of this explanation. You probably feel defeated, dejected, depressed, and passive. And those are not the kinds of emotions you need to energize you to make your next sales call. So let's revisit the situation, this time offering an optimistic explanation. So the same event occurs. You receive this terrible news from your best account. And as you drive away, you think to yourself, now, quote, they really made a bad mistake this time. It's a good thing the contract is only for a year. That gives me time to work to get it back. I'm glad it was only this account and no others. End quote. Now that's an optimistic explanation because your explanation was not personal, permanent, or pervasive. Right now, having just said that to yourself, how do you feel about your future as a result? You probably feel energized and hopeful. So do you see the difference? The event was the same. The only difference was the way you explained it to yourself. One set of explanations was optimistic and leading to energy and hope, while the others was pessimistic, leading to dejection and passivity. The difference was how you thought about it. And Dr. Seligman has used optimistic behavior as one of the characteristics of successful people. Using various techniques that he developed, he predicted elections by analyzing each candidate's explanatory style. The most optimistic candidates often win elections. And not only that, but athletic contests. Read the interviews of the players before the game, and the most optimistic team generally wins. The implications for you are incredibly awesome. See, if you're going to improve your explanatory style and make it more optimistic, you'll create more positive energy and hope for yourself. And no matter how difficult or negative the circumstances with which you must deal, it is a matter of choosing your thoughts. So learned optimism is the specific application of a very, very powerful biblical truth. And that is, quote, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Learned optimism is one way to do that. It can be one of your most powerful self-management techniques. It's based on this powerful principle. Your thoughts influence your feelings and your actions, and you can choose your thoughts. Wow. Learn to control and choose your thoughts is a learned skill. Just like active listening, learning to do that marks a huge step in your development. That's why it is one of the 25 most important lessons I have learned. Hey, will you recommend this podcast to others? I'd like to build the readership. We deal with some practical wisdom here, help you build businesses and careers that are rewarding and fulfilling. Just refer this to others. And by the way, we have a whole series of shows. This is number 300. So if you want to scroll back and see many of the 300 other podcasts, please feel free to do that. And by the way, I'd also love for you to put a positive review on whatever system you're listening to this. Okay? That'd be great. That's it. We're done. Bye-bye.